The baby began to cry just as the auctioneer raised his hand, and the sound cut through Redemption Creek like a blade through dry air. Some in the crowd shifted their boots. Others stared straight ahead, as if looking away could make the moment pass faster. On the rough wooden platform stood Margaret Flynn, her back straight, her chin lifted, her infant pressed against her chest. She did not beg. She did not weep. But her hands trembled, and she could feel the eyes of the town weighing her like livestock. The auction platform had been thrown together from old boards and barrels, set up in the center of the street where wagons usually rolled through. Dust hung low in the afternoon heat. The banker, a neat man in a pressed coat, stood beside the auctioneer with folded hands and a thin, patient smile. He kept saying the same words to anyone who questioned him. This is lawful. This is necessary. This is how debts are settled. Margaret had heard those words all morning. Her husband's name had been spoken as if it were an account entry, not a life. The debts were small. The banker admitted that freely, but unpaid. A farm loan. Medical bills from the winter illness that had taken Thomas Flynn and left her alone with a newborn and a collapsing roof. The banker spoke softly, politely, as if that gentleness somehow excused what was happening. He even nodded to Margaret once, a gesture meant to appear respectful. She met his eyes without flinching. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began again. He described Margaret as capable, young, and still useful. He described the child as healthy. A few men laughed uneasily. One woman in the crowd turned away, her mouth tight, her hands clenched in her apron. Others watched with open interest, their expressions stripped of shame by the comfort of numbers and rules. Margaret's thoughts moved inward, where the noise could not reach. She focused on the warmth of her son, on the steady rise and fall of his small body. She reminded herself that she was still standing, that she was still herself. They could take her name, her home, her future, but they would not take that. The bidding began slow, hesitant. A few hands lifted and fell. Each number spoken aloud felt like a small tearing inside her chest. She had stopped listening when a new sound reached her, one that did not belong to the crowd. Hooves. They came from the far end of the street, unhurried, steady. Heads turned. The auctioneer paused, annoyed at the interruption. A lone rider moved through the gathered people as if they were parting water. He wore a dust-stained coat and a plain hat pulled low, his face shadowed by the brim. He did not rush. He did not apologize for being late. He stopped near the platform and looked up. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the banker leaned forward slightly and said, in the same calm voice he had used all day, "Sir, you're interrupting a legal proceeding?" The rider dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with quiet finality. "How much?" he asked. "To settle the debt?" The crowd murmured. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard. The banker's smile tightened, but he recovered quickly. He named the amount, rounding it up, as if daring the stranger to object. The man reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. He opened it, counted carefully, and placed the money in the banker's hands. There was no flourish, no announcement. Just the soft clink of coin, heavy and undeniable. "That covers it," the man said. The auctioneer looked to the banker. The banker weighed the pouch, then nodded once. "The debt is satisfied," he said, his tone smooth, almost relieved. "The matter is concluded." A hush fell over the street. Margaret realized she was holding her breath. Her legs felt weak, as if the platform had shifted beneath her. She looked at the stranger, searching his face for expectation, for demand. She found none. His expression was calm, distant, as if this had always been the only possible outcome. He stepped closer to the platform and offered his hand, not to claim her, but to help her down. "You're free to go," he said quietly. Free. The word felt unreal, fragile. She hesitated, then accepted his hand. His grip was firm, respectful. When her feet touched the ground, the crowd seemed to retreat, their curiosity satisfied, their discomfort unresolved. The banker cleared his throat and spoke again, polite as ever. "A generous act," he said. "Not many would take on such responsibility." The man met his gaze. Someone had to. He turned away then, already leading Margaret and her child out of the circle. The street closed behind them. The auction platform left standing in the dust like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge. Margaret did not know his name. She did not know why he had come. All she knew was that the worst moment of her life had been witnessed and ended by a stranger who asked for nothing. And as they walked away from Redemption Creek, the weight of that truth began to settle, heavy with questions she was not yet ready to ask. The boarding house room was small and clean, with a single oil lamp casting a soft yellow circle against the walls. Outside, Redemption Creek had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that came after something unpleasant had already happened. Margaret sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her baby asleep at last in a wooden cradle near the window. Every sound made her tense. A floorboard creaked somewhere below, and her shoulders stiffened before she caught herself. The man who had stopped the auction stood near the door, his hat resting in his hands. He had not removed his coat. He had not sat down. He seemed aware of the space between them and careful not to cross it. "You don't owe me anything," he said, as if answering a question she had not yet spoken. Margaret studied him closely now. In the daylight she had barely seen his face. Here, in the lamplight, she noticed the lines around his eyes and the stillness in his posture. He looked like someone used to standing alone. That did not make him safe. It only made him quiet. "You paid a debt that wasn't yours," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands rested protectively on her knees. "Men don't do that without a reason." He nodded once, accepting the truth of it. "That's fair." Silence filled the room again. Margaret's thoughts ran ahead of her. She had been passed from one decision to another all day without choice. She would not let that continue. "I need to know why," she said, "before I go anywhere with you, before I let you anywhere near my child." At that, something shifted in him. Not anger, not offense, something heavier. He moved to the chair by the wall and sat, placing his hat carefully on the floor. He kept his eyes on his hands as he spoke. "My name is Miles Sutton," he said. "I rode with your husband for a short time, years back." Her breath caught before she could stop it. "Thomas?" He nodded. "We worked cattle together south of here. He wasn't a loud man, but he was steady. One night things went wrong. Storm came in fast. I made a bad call. He didn't leave me behind." Margaret felt the room narrow, as if the past had stepped closer. "What happened?" "We both made it out," Miles said. "But I've carried that night with me. He never asked for payment, never spoke of it again. Men like that don't get forgotten." Margaret looked down at her sleeping son. She had wondered how much of his father would remain in the world. The thought that Thomas had once saved this stranger, quietly and without reward, settled into her chest. "That doesn't explain today," she said. "It does to me," Miles replied. "When I heard his name in town this morning, and what they were doing, I couldn't ride past it. Paying the debt was the least I could do." She waited. "And after that?" He met her eyes then. "After that, I figured the choice was yours." The words surprised her. No one had said that to her since Thomas died. Choice. Real choice. "You're offering help," she said carefully. "But help always comes with strings." "Not this time," Miles said. "I have a ranch west of here. It's isolated, but it's safe. You and the baby can stay as long as you need. No contracts. No expectations." Margaret searched his face again, looking for cracks, for hints of control or hidden demands. She saw none. That frightened her more than a clear threat would have. "And if I say no?" she asked. Then I'll make sure you're not bothered again in this town, he said simply. And I'll ride on. The lamp flickered. Margaret realized she had been holding herself rigid, braced for something she had learned to expect. Slowly, she let her shoulders drop. You didn't even ask my name, she said. Miles, he said gently. I know who you are, but I didn't think it was my place to use it. That, more than anything else, eased something inside her. Still, fear lingered. Trust did not come easily after public shame. If I go with you, she said, it's for my child. Not because I owe your memory of my husband anything. Miles stood. That's how it should be. She looked at her son again, then back at the man who had stepped into their lives without force or claim. The night felt long, uncertain, and fragile. All right, Margaret said at last. One night at a time. Miles nodded. That's enough. And for the first time since the auction, Margaret felt the faintest sense that the ground beneath her might finally hold. The trail stretched westward in a long, pale line, cutting through open land that seemed to have no end. By the second day of travel, Redemption Creek was far behind them, reduced to a memory Margaret did not care to carry. She rode in the wagon with her son wrapped close, the steady creak of the wheels marking time. Miles walked beside the team, reins loose in his hands, setting a pace that matched the land rather than his own strength. They spoke little at first. The space between them was filled with watchfulness, with the quiet effort of learning another person's presence. Miles never rode ahead without looking back. He checked the wagon's straps, adjusted the blankets when the wind shifted, and kept the fire low at night, so the smoke would not draw attention. Margaret noticed these things even when she said nothing. By the third afternoon, clouds gathered without warning. The sky darkened, the air thickened, and the wind came hard across the grass. Miles pointed toward a low structure half hidden among a stand of scrub trees. Line shack, he said. Not much, but it'll do. They reached it just as the rain began. The shack leaned slightly, its boards weathered and gray, but it held. Inside it smelled of old wood and dust. Miles set to work without speaking, blocking gaps with spare cloth, building a fire from dry kindling stored in a corner. Margaret settled the baby on a blanket and watched, her nerves tight as the storm pressed in. Thunder rolled overhead, slow and heavy. The sound stirred something she had tried to keep buried. Her breath shortened. Her hands shook as she held her son closer. Miles noticed. He did not ask questions. He simply moved the fire so the light reached her side of the room and spoke quietly. You're safe here. She wanted to believe him. Part of her did. Another part remembered the last storm she had waded through, the night Thomas never came home from checking the fence line. Rain like this. Wind like this. Hope stretched thin until it broke. The baby stirred, sensing her fear. Margaret rocked him, whispering words she barely heard herself say. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving a deep silence behind. Outside, the land steamed under the fading light. Miles stepped out to check the horses. When he returned, his expression had changed. One of them threw a shoe, he said. We'll have to stay the night. Margaret's chest tightened. Another delay. Another night exposed. Is that dangerous? Not if we're careful, Miles said. Then, after a pause, I should have pushed harder today. This is on me. The words surprised her. Men she had known before spoke of blame as something to avoid. Miles accepted it without hesitation. That night, as the fire burned low, Margaret found herself speaking without planning to. Thomas hated storms, she said softly. He said they reminded him how small choices can carry big weight. Miles looked up. He said something like that to me once, he replied. Right before that night I told you about. She turned toward him. You never told me what choice you made. He stared into the fire. I chose speed over sense. Thought I knew better than the weather. He followed because he trusted me. The room felt smaller. Margaret felt the edge of anger rise, sharp and unexpected. For a moment, she wanted to pull back, to protect herself from this man who carried part of her loss. "You could have walked away," she said. "You didn't." "No," Miles said. "I didn't." Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. The baby slept on, unaware of the tension holding the room. Finally, Miles spoke again. "If you want to turn back tomorrow, I won't stop you. I won't ask you to trust someone who failed your husband once." Margaret looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the weight he carried. Not excuses, not pride, responsibility. She thought of the auction platform, of his hand offered without claim, of the way he took blame now, even when it cost him her goodwill. "No," she said slowly. "We keep going. Running from storms doesn't change what they take from you." Something eased in his shoulders. Not relief, respect. By morning, the land was clear and bright. The horse was reshod, the wagon ready. As they moved back onto the trail, Margaret felt something new settle inside her. Not trust, not yet, but peace, thin as the morning light, and just as real. Morning on the ranch came quietly, without the noise of town or the press of strangers. Sunlight spilled across open ground, touching the worn fence rails and the low house set back from the creek. Margaret stood on the porch with her son in her arms and took in the stillness. For the first time in many months, no one was watching her to judge or measure what she was worth. The house was plain but solid. Miles had prepared one of the rooms before they arrived. A small space with a clean bed, a washstand, and a cradle built by hand. He did not present it with pride. He simply showed her where things were, then stepped back and let her decide how to use the space. That choice mattered more than comfort. Days began to find a rhythm. Miles worked the land and the animals with steady patience. Margaret learned the layout of the ranch, the way the light shifted across the fields, the places where the ground dipped and rose. She took on tasks when she felt ready, tending the garden, mending clothes, preparing meals. Each simple act restored something that had been taken from her, piece by piece. Miles never gave orders. When he spoke, it was to ask, not to direct. "Would you like help?" Or, "Does this suit you?" Those questions stayed with Margaret, quiet reminders that she was not a burden or an obligation. They rode into the nearby town once a week for supplies. The first time, Margaret braced herself, expecting whispers or stares. There were some, but they passed quickly. Miles walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. At the store, he let her speak for herself. When the shopkeeper addressed him instead of her, Miles waited until the man corrected himself. It was in town that Margaret began to feel the weight of being seen again. A few women watched her with curiosity. One or two offered cautious smiles. During a small gathering near the square, she held her son and felt something she had not expected. Belonging, thin but growing. She realized she had not been invited as someone's property or responsibility. She was simply there. At the ranch, evenings became a time for quiet conversation. They spoke of small things at first. Weather, crops, Miles' plans to repair the barn. Gradually, memories surfaced. Margaret spoke of her life with Thomas, not in grief, but in honesty. Miles listened without interruption. When he spoke of his past, he chose his words carefully, never asking for sympathy. The change between them was subtle. A shared glance across the table. The way Miles checked the gate before nightfall without being asked. The way Margaret began setting an extra place at supper without thinking about it. None of it was spoken aloud. One afternoon, neighbors rode up unannounced. A family from the next valley, curious more than anything else. They stayed for coffee and polite talk. Margaret noticed how Miles introduced her. Not as someone he had taken in, simply by her name. Later, after they left, Margaret asked him about it. "You didn't explain." "There was nothing to explain," Miles said. That night, as the stars came out and the land settled into rest, Margaret sat on the porch steps, her son asleep against her shoulder. Miles joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she said, surprising herself with the truth in her voice. "Not safe, not whole." Miles did not answer right away. "I didn't think I'd ever build something that lasted," he said finally. "I'm better at passing through." She turned to look at him. "You don't have to be." The words hung between them, unclaimed but understood. Miles looked out across the land, then back at her. "I won't take more than you're willing to give," he said. Margaret nodded. That was enough. The ranch no longer felt like a place of shelter alone. It felt like the beginning of something that required care, honesty, and courage from them both. As the season moved forward, the sense of survival gave way to something deeper. Life was no longer measured by fear of the next day, but by the hope of the one after. And in that quiet stretch of land, far from Redemption Creek, Margaret realized she was not rebuilding alone. Winter came quietly, settling over the ranch in pale layers that softened the land and slowed time itself. Snow gathered along the fence rails and rested on the low roof of the house. Smoke rose steady from the chimney each morning, a sign of warmth held against the cold. Margaret learned the sounds of winter, the creak of wood, the hush of falling snow, the distant call of cattle moving carefully across frozen ground. Miles had gone out early one afternoon to check a far line of fencing near the trees. He said he would be back before dark. Margaret watched him ride out, the baby bundled close in her arms, and felt no unease at first. This was their life now. Ordinary, steady. But daylight faded faster than expected. The sky thickened with gray, and the wind began to rise. Margaret stood by the window, scanning the open land. No rider appeared. She told herself not to worry. Miles was careful. He always was. As the light slipped away, fear returned without asking permission. It felt too familiar, too sharp. She fed her son, laid him down, and wrapped herself in a coat. Outside, the wind carried snow sideways, blurring the world into white and shadow. Still, there was no sign of Miles. Margaret waited as long as she could. Then she made a choice. She left the house with a lantern, her steps slow but determined. The cold cut through her gloves. Each step into the snow reminded her how easily the land could take someone back if it wished. She followed the path toward the trees, her heart pounding not from effort, but from memory. Near the creek, she saw a horse standing alone, reins tangled, breath steaming in the cold air. Panic rose hard and fast. "Miles!" she called, her voice thin against the wind. She found him a short distance away, struggling to his feet, one leg caught awkwardly. He had slipped on ice, twisted his ankle badly. He looked up when he heard her and gave a tired smile that did not hide his pain. "You shouldn't have come out," he said. "You didn't come back," she replied. Her hands shook as she helped him steady himself. "I wasn't staying behind again." They moved slowly, supporting each other, every step a test. By the time they reached the house, both were exhausted. Margaret settled Miles by the fire and tended to him with calm focus. She realized as she worked that her fear had changed. It was no longer fear of being alone in the world. It was fear of losing what they had built. That night, as the storm passed and the house grew still, Miles spoke quietly. "When I didn't make it back, I thought about leaving things unfinished. I've done that before. I don't want to anymore." Margaret sat across from him, the firelight warm on her face. "Neither do I." Days passed as Miles healed. Winter held the ranch in silence, giving them time they did not rush to fill. One morning, they walked slowly to the edge of the land where the creek froze in gentle curves. The baby slept between them, wrapped and warm. Miles stopped near the trees and turned to Margaret. He did not kneel. He did not offer grand words. "I can't promise ease," he said, but I can promise presence, choice, a home that's shared. Margaret felt tears gather, not from sadness, but from recognition. I choose that, she said. I choose you. They married quietly before winter ended, with no crowd and no spectacle. The land bore witness. That was enough. Spring came slow but certain. Grass returned. Water ran free again. The ranch filled with life, not because it had been rescued, but because it had been claimed together. One evening, Margaret stood on the porch, watching her son take unsteady steps across the yard, Miles close behind, ready but not hovering. She realized then that the auction platform, the storm, the fear, all of it had led here, not as a straight path, but as a series of choices made when it mattered most. The past had not been erased. It had been answered. And as the sun dipped low and the land stretched wide and open before them, Margaret understood that some families are not given by law or blood alone, but built, quietly, deliberately, by those willing to stand when others turn away.